Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar, Fake News and the Anti-Choice Movement. And this is going to be a very special presentation from our friends at NARAL Pro-Choice America and Media Matters for America. So first we'll get started with your hosts. One of the people you're hearing is me, Erin Matson. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm one of the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction.
And this other voice is Pamela Merritt. I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri, and I am the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction.
Great, so we have a pretty simple agenda. We're going to introduce Reproaction, then hand this over to our friends at NARAL and Media Matters to lead us through their presentation. We'll talk about next steps, and then we'll go to Q&A. So a couple housekeeping things. If you have questions and answers, Pamela is going to be leading that session at the end. So just put questions in the chat box at any point as we go through this presentation, and she'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. The other housekeeping Q&A that I want to share is that we will have a recording of this available after the webinar. So first, who is Reproaction? Reproaction is a new direct action group forming to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We're incredibly proud of our left flank analysis, including a willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable to increasing access to abortion and advancing reproductive justice, whether they're typically thought of as allies or opposition. And we have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action. And with that, I will pass it over to Sharon and Hannah to introduce themselves.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Sharon Kann, and I'm the Program Director of Reproductive Rights at Media Matters for America. At Media Matters, we are experts on the media coverage trends, and in the case of my program, how those things intersect with anti-choice misinformation. I'm joined by my colleague from NARAL, Hannah Groch-Begley, who's the Director of Opposition Research, which means that she is an expert on how the anti-choice movement operates as a political machine. And we're going to talk to you about fake news and how anti-choice misinformation misleads people.
All right, thanks, Sharon. This is Hannah again. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. We're going to go through a lot of information today. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by fake news and sort of talk about a food chain that Sharon and I have identified through our work, where we see this food chain of fake news from sort of certain sources that you might recognize on social media, sort of fake websites that have increasingly begun to pop up, all the way to traditional news media. And so when we talk about fake news, we're really talking about misinformation that we see that pervades across that entire spectrum, and that really pops to the forefront. The goal of today, as this slide says, is to arm you with the facts on the most common myths that we see occurring in that food chain, and the most common people pushing those myths, misinformers. And the idea is that we want everyone to help stop the spread of fake news in any way they can. And so we're going to go through some of those top myths, what you can say in response, sort of the factual response to them, who these people are, and sort of who you should think of as having an automatic red flag whenever you see them mentioned in news or media, the impact that this fake news has on our lives and women's safety, and some tools of how you can help, basics of vetting news sources and how to combat abortion stigma.
Great. So I think before we jump into different types of misinformation that we have seen at Media Matters in our work, we want to talk a little bit about what fake news is, because I think especially since the election, it's been a question a lot of people have been asking. So at Media Matters, we tend to use this definition of fake news. I won't read it to you because you can see it on the screen, but some key points I want to pull out from it. The first is that at Media Matters, we're much less interested, and in general, we think people should be much less interested in whether or not something should be labeled fake news and getting into that fight. It's much more interesting to think about how particular pieces of information operate to mislead people, which is why our definition emphasizes that it's about a particular piece of misinformation, not whether or not an individual or an outlet is itself fake news, which I think is how a lot of people have seen the term deployed. The reason why I think this is important in this context and in the context of people who want to be advocates for abortion access and reproductive rights is because the kernels of misinformation that are misleading people about what abortion is or how access functions are the things that generally get propagated as fake news, the things that, because we don't have an understanding of them or because misinformation is prevalent, can then be packaged as legitimate news themselves, which is where we get into problems with people needing to be able to vet information. So at Media Matters, we do a variety of media coverage studies. And one of our sort of pieces, one of the bigger ones that we do every year is what we call our Reproductive Rights and Abortion Coverage Study. It's an annual study over 12 months. And as part of this, we identified 350 examples of when on primetime cable news, people were talking about abortion or reproductive rights. Of these 350 segments over the course of the past year, we identified that 64% of them had some type of misinformation about abortion and reproductive rights, which you think about how many people are getting their news from the news or from stories that then come off of primetime coverage, that's a huge amount of misinformation. Some of the things that we coded for, I'll talk through the baseline things so we can understand sort of the most common ones. But the first one, and I think the most prevalent, was that abortion is almost never discussed as anything but a political issue. So when these things are talked about, nobody really has context for understanding what the reality is because it's never talked about in terms of consequences. So with that sort of framework for what we looked at, this first slide looks at the most common piece of misinformation we saw, which was misinformation about late-term abortion. We coded specifically for how often people were talking about late-term abortion, and we actually found that even though late-term abortions don't represent the majority of procedures done in the United States, it is the topic that dominates every conversation, almost to the exclusion of everything else. So anytime someone is talking about abortion, even if the conversation was supposed to be about Planned Parenthood or contraceptives or even unconstitutional 6-week abortion bans, like what almost happened in Ohio, they're only talking about late-term abortion, which is not representative of even the policies being discussed oftentimes. You can see from here that Fox News was the leader in misinformation about late-term abortion. They were incorrect or inaccurate 94% of the time. There were 94 total statements made on the network during our study, and 88 of them were incorrect. The leader, the follow-up, I guess, then is CNN, which was inaccurate 75% of the time, and MSNBC, which was inaccurate 73% of the time. The amount of misinformation is obviously concerning, but I want to point out just the volume that's coming out as well. It's concerning that Fox News is incorrect 94% of the time on this topic, but if you look at how often they're saying the inaccurate information in comparison to CNN or MSNBC, and they're not talking about other types of abortion accurately, it means that we should be concerned. It's not just they're spreading misinformation, it's that most of the information out there is going to be inaccurate. So we want to go through then sort of what you'll see when you see this misinformation and then what you can say in response. So ways that you'll see this play out are you'll hear a lot of people use phrases like partial birth abortion or abortion on demand or abortion up until the moment of birth. We see a lot of examples on Facebook where even if people are trying to debunk these things, they'll still use that type of language to discuss it. So the example here is that this is a post from the Globe and Mail on Facebook. They're talking about the third presidential debate when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump discussed abortion, and I use discussed in this case lightly. But they talked about abortion, and Trump alleged that partial birth abortion was happening, and he had a gruesome description, none of which was accurate. But even when people were talking about it then, they used that language to discuss it. So that brings up the question of then, what can you say when you see things like this? Which, if you can do the next slide. Thank you. So there are a couple of responses to this. The first is that you should be aware that partial birth abortion is a fiction. It was something that admittedly was invented by the National Right to Life Committee to villainize people who were having later term abortions for medically legitimate reasons, and it was purely made up. The second thing you can say is that you should talk about the actual circumstances that necessitate late term abortion. 99% of abortions occur before the 20-week mark, but the situations in which late-term abortion is necessary are usually out of extreme fetal abnormality or the life and health of the mother, which is something the Supreme Court has explicitly protected. So when people try to talk about this as if it's something illegitimate or not allowed, it's in fact explicitly protected by the Supreme Court. We saw this a lot in the study, is that even when people were trying to debunk claims about partial birth abortion, they still use the language of partial birth abortion to talk about it, or still used stereotypes or misinformation about late-term abortion, instead of focusing on the fact that it's a made-up term and that there's a legal and necessary right to this. So the second myth that we identified, or the second most common, was misinformation about the types of services that Planned Parenthood provides. And I think a lot of us through the past couple of years have probably seen more conversation about this coming up in cable news than maybe even before. And so it's concerning when misinformation is being spread here. So our findings show that with the exception of Fox, which was evenly split, most networks were pretty good about accurately identifying the types of services that Planned Parenthood provides. We coded for things like people mentioning, Planned Parenthood provides access to contraceptives, pap smears, and cancer screenings, and that was coded as an accurate statement. But then statements like Planned Parenthood could easily be replaced, there are tons of people to fill the gap, no lapses of service will happen, were coded as inaccurate, which we can get into why in a minute, but that's sort of what we are looking at. To pull out some examples here, you'll notice that Fox is evenly split, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what that means, because it doesn't mean that they're doing a good job, but it does mean that there's something interesting with how they're framing arguments to people. A lot of what we see on Fox is that they tend to employ straw person tactics when talking about this. So they'll do something like, well, some people say Planned Parenthood is an essential provider. However, and then they'll go on to have any number of inaccurate statements. So they'll set up the idea to knock it down. The second reason why is that Fox has a weird subset of commentators who will come on and they'll say things, they'll make the unrealistic argument that's like, Planned Parenthood is good at some things, but if they just didn't do abortion care, which as we know is an essential health service that isn't paid for by the government. And so the sort of way that they'll try to split the balance there is by having otherwise inaccurate claims be couched in terms of, but maybe there's other stuff too, which is why you see that balance there. So how you'll see this manifest when you see media outside of cable news is that you'll see a lot of times the claim that community health centers can easily replace Planned Parenthood. And on the right here, we have a screenshot of a live action post saying that, the text is long, but essentially that, Planned Parenthood will no longer get your tax dollars for family planning services. And now community health centers that do not commit abortions can get money to do like more basic care. You'll see a lot of different ways of saying this. So sometimes you'll see people talk about community health centers or federally qualified health centers, but always the emphasis is on the idea that these centers are already existent in like the safety net for healthcare and can fill in the slack. What you can say then, because this is not an accurate statement, is a couple of things. The first is that experts disagree with the claim that Planned Parenthood can be taken out of the equation. They've called it a gross misrepresentation of what even the best community health centers could do, because they're not configured to take on that volume of clients, and they're not configured to provide all of the services that Planned Parenthood currently provides. The second thing you can do is when you hear the claim that community health centers can fill in, you should ask yourself, and if it's a conversation you're having with other advocates, you should ask them, what types of services can actually be provided by these replacement clinics? So I think there was reporting where the state of Florida tried to remove Planned Parenthood from their reproductive health safety net. And when reporters started asking the questions of, well, what are these centers that can replace them? What do they do? The people that were on that list ended up being things like dentist office, school nurses, and in some cases, I think a prison. And so the reason why these lists show up like this is because to be classified as a community health center, you have to provide a certain number of services, but you don't have to provide all types of services. So just because there are dentist offices that might qualify as community health centers and provide that type of basic care to people in their community, that doesn't mean they can do the same thing as Planned Parenthood, which is why these numbers aren't a one-to-one and often can be confusing if people aren't asking follow-up questions. The third thing you can do is identify the source of the claim that Planned Parenthood can be easily replaced. And on the right here, we have a graphic that I know I've seen circulating around Twitter and around my Facebook feed that purports to show the comparison between community health or comprehensive or community health clinics and Planned Parenthood. The top slide shows the alleged number of community health centers that are in a community. So the white is where every center is supposed to be. And the bottom slide is supposed to represent everywhere there's orange where a Planned Parenthood is. If you look at the source of this graphic, however, you can see that at the bottom they're boxed in. They were created by the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Charlotte Lozier Institute, and it directs you to a page for ADF to get more information. all these organizations are explicitly anti-choice in their mission. In an ADS case, they're a designated hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so the information they're sharing here is not unbiased, and you shouldn't share it uncritically, and always ask if people are where they're getting that information. The other thing I want to point out here is that it's not always easy to spot when this is happening and people are making claims about access to healthcare or access to abortion, because it's not always anti-choice groups. Some of you might have seen recently the New York Times has been running a series of op-eds by sometimes explicitly anti-choice groups, but not always. And the argument often is that in order to garner political favor, Democrats or whoever need to stop advocating for abortion access. The problem with this argument is that it assumes that abortion isn't an economic good, and it assumes that access to it does not better people's position economically and socially. This is to say that there have been studies that have proven that access to abortion care helps people get out of poverty. It means that they're able to better economically participate, if that is their choice to have one then, when, to make a family when they're ready. And most importantly, that in most cases, because the government doesn't pay for access to abortion, because the Hyde Amendment prevents that, people who can't access abortion care often are those who are already in economically precarious situations. So if people are telling you that you shouldn't focus on abortion as an economic issue, or that you should only think about it in terms of other services, you should just be aware that that's a similar form of misinformation.
All right, great. Thanks, Sharon. So just to take a second to step back, because that was a lot of information. As we said at the beginning, when we talk about fake news, we're talking about specific kinds of information, which is why we wanted to go into the specific types that we see most prevalent. And again, we can see these on, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, but we can also see it on Facebook memes, on the websites that seem to crop up every day that you've never heard of before. That what we've seen in doing this work for a while now is that it's all the same. That one might be better produced than the other. One might be written to outrage, whereas sort of a more traditional news source might be written to appear authoritative. But the misinformation they're purveying is often exactly the same. And that's because it's often coming from the same source. That we've really identified a number of anti-choice groups and people who are really top of the game here of making sure that this misinformation and these misleading factoids get on to every possible news source, whether it's a weird blog that my family in Texas reads, or a New York Times op-ed. And so what we wanted to do is just talk about three of these people who you see, who I really think of as the top misinformers in this field, because they often will show up on sort of more mainstream news. They'll write op-eds, they'll do all that, and they'll sort of couch their words in this rhetoric that makes it sound more reasonable, makes it sound like they're just having a disagreement of opinion. And really what we do, and what I do particularly in my work, is expose the true agenda behind that rhetoric. And so I wanted to talk about these three individuals and their organizations, just to give you guys red flags that if you ever see them or their organizations behind any piece of information that you're seeing online, there's a good chance that there's a shady agenda behind that, and that it's an immediate red flag. So the first is Abby Johnson. She runs a group called And Then There Were None. They're an organization that targets abortion clinic workers and tries to convince them to leave their jobs. The fact I always give about her to sort of reveal her true agenda is that she has consistently claimed that birth control will give you cancer, and that abortion will give you cancer as well. And we often hear that misinformation, that abortion will give you cancer, which is completely unproven. But Abby Johnson takes it that step further and also tries to discourage women from taking birth control. And I've personally listened to her try to advocate against anyone ever taking birth control, and really making that someday illegal. The second person on this list is Marjorie Dannenfelser from Susan B. Anthony List. Susan B. Anthony List is a really important organization to know about these days. They have gotten exceedingly more powerful under the Trump administration. They jumped on the Trump train fairly early in the campaign, and they have been rewarded for that. And they're a pretty powerful political organization. The best example I have of sort of their extremism, though there are several, is that Marjorie Dannenfelser, the president, has said that she finds rape exceptions regrettable, just wrong, completely intellectually dishonest, and abominable. That, you know, she and her organization truly want to ban abortion outright, no exceptions whatsoever. And I think that that is really relevant context when you're reading something that seems more moderate from her, or when you're seeing her, you know, working closely with the White House, which she does do now. And then finally, the last one I wanted to flag was Kristen Hawkins, the president of Students for Life. Students for Life is an organization that has chapters at colleges and universities across the country. And those chapters are really student-led, and so there can be a wide variety in those chapters and what they believe and what they sort of pursue in terms of action. But the head of the organization, Kristen Hawkins, said just this year on MSNBC, just back in January, that she thought birth control pills and IUDs should be illegal. Even when you think about the pro-life movement writ large, that's a fairly extreme statement. Most of them wouldn't come out publicly and say they think birth control pills or IUDs should be illegal. She did it, and she did it on MSNBC. So these are things that you can really help, as Sharon was saying, going back to the source of where Kann comes from. If the source is any one of these groups, that's an immediate way for you to be able to say, I'm not gonna take this information at face value, because there's likely an agenda behind it.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about types of misinformation that then find their way into packages of fake news. And we've talked about some of the more prevalent sources of that misinformation. So we want to talk a little bit about, before we get into strategies for what to do about it, why it's important and why we should talk about these things. The first impact of fake news we want to highlight is abortion stigma. And intentional misinformation about abortion does contribute to abortion stigma, but part of that is also unintentional and sometimes culturally ingrained and perpetuated by either a lack of information about abortion or just a lack of understanding about the context that people who choose to have abortions are in. So an explicit example is this image from a Fox News broadcast. As you can see, it's about something called the heartbeat bill, where it says abortions will be illegal after 6 weeks, but the image is of a person who appears far more pregnant than 6 weeks along in a pregnancy. So the fact that to talk about a bill that would have banned abortion before 6 or after 6 weeks, at which point you can't even tell somebody is pregnant, and they're using an image of a later term pregnancy, sort of demonstrates that they're trying to, or at least they're unintentionally sort of ingraining the idea that abortion is always something that's occurring at a later term, and it sort of just creates associations in the viewer's mind. The implicit example, it's not always something that's as visually obvious as this. Sometimes using words like tragic or heart-wrenching to describe an abortion experience is something that's sort of culturally ingrained as the reaction. Now, people can experience any number of feelings about having an abortion, and none of those are invalid that people experience. But we shouldn't make assumptions, and we especially shouldn't make our sort of perceptions scripted onto whoever is choosing to have an abortion. And so thinking about abortion stigma and how misinformation about that, you know, leads to it, I think is something that's important to do.
The other problem is, you know, it's not just that this is media coverage, or it's not just that this misinformation is showing up on your Facebook feeds or your Twitter feeds. It's also getting codified into law. So earlier, for example, I discussed how several pro-life leaders, including Abby Johnson, claim abortion will give you cancer, contrary to medical evidence. 5 states have actually passed laws requiring doctors to lie to women, to provide materials to women seeking abortion, stating that there is a link between breast cancer and abortion. This is Alaska, Kansas, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Texas. And this is just false. Multiple medical associations have proven it to be false. And yet doctors are sort of contra to the evidence and contra to their own desire to give women safe, accurate evidence, are being forced to lie. The second group that we just wanted to highlight, and these are really just 2 examples, there are laws all over the place, is that a number of states have been introducing and passing laws requiring doctors to tell women that it is possible to reverse a medication abortion in the middle of the process. You may hear this called abortion reversal. These bills require doctors to share an anti-choice talking point that, again, has just been completely medically disproven. It is not based in science or fact. In fact, it can actually put women in harm's way if they sort of get halfway through the medical abortion procedure and then try to reverse it somehow. This is a tactic specifically used to confuse women seeking abortions and perpetuate the idea that women receiving abortions are sort of flighty, that they change their minds, or that they regret their decisions, which, again, the statistics just don't bear out. In just February of this year, abortion reversal bills were introduced in North Carolina and passed through the House in Indiana and Utah. This is happening right now. So, as I said, we've gone through a lot of information already, just sort of giving you guys the facts that you need in order to sort of engage with fake news and push back on anti-choice misinformation in particular. And we want to go through some other things that you can do to help as we think about this fake news as a problem writ large. So obviously we're just talking about a sliver of it today, but a lot of the skills that we're about to go into can be used on any number of topics. And so the three that we have sort of identified is getting better at vetting information in the first place, reporting misinformation when you see it, and then replacing it with accurate information. So when we think of vetting information, I'm sure most of the people who are on this webinar are skilled in this. I just wanted to go through a couple things that I think about personally when I'm vetting information that I'm seeing for the first time, or I'm vetting a new outlet that I don't really recognize, that I find to be super helpful. The first is thinking about independence. Is it clear to me that the outlet or the person pushing this information is independent from interested sources, you know, or if they're not, do they disclose that? So we live in a capitalist society. There are very few news organizations at this point that aren't owned by some kind of company or rich person. Are they properly disclosing that fact? Are there multiple verified perspectives? Verified is really important here. When you talk to people about the news, often you'll hear that there's this problem of both sides, and that is a very real problem. You know, it's not fair for a news article to say, scientists say the sky is blue, but this person on the street says the sky is green. That is offering multiple perspectives, but one of those perspectives is not verified and has no business sort of entering into this debate. And so making sure that the news story or the outlet is really verifying the multiple perspectives and then allowing people to see when there is debate among scientists, for instance. And then finally, accountability. Do they have processes in place to admit mistake, to correct errors, to make sure that errors don't occur again? A legitimate news organization will have often someone whose full-time job is to deal with errors and to think through how the newsroom can prevent them in the future. A lot of these newer organizations you're seeing pop up that are purveying fake news, of course they don't have that. In fact, the point is to be putting out mistakes and putting out things that they may correct later, but they know that the damage is done. And so thinking of those three I find to be a useful rubric.
Great. So once you have vetted a piece of information and you've determined that it is either inaccurate or in fact being packaged as a legitimate news or political argument, there's a couple of things you can do about it. And the second step of that then is to report. I wanted to talk through quickly just one of the ways on Facebook that you can report things as false news or as misinforming. And that's to, once you see a post, you go up to the, I guess, triangle in the upper right-hand corner, and you can go down to report post. And usually this would have given you options like it's spam, it's threatening, it shouldn't be on Facebook, but they've added recently an option for it's a false news story. So if you do that and you select it and enough people also report that in aggregate, it means that Facebook will actually either flag the post as a false news story which can mean that people, when they engage with it, realize it before they share it, or sometimes they will actually remove the post entirely.
Another way you can report, if you're not going to report directly to Facebook, or even after you've reported directly to an organization like Facebook, is you can report to us. NARAL has an email account, researchtips@naral.org. It's written on the slide here. And what we really are open to is for you to flag for us times when you see inaccurate claims or claims that you think are inaccurate on reproductive rights that are coming from reporters, news outlets, prominent activist organizations, people who should know better, basically. There's a lot of noise out there. I can't fact check every single thing that pops up, even on my own Facebook feed. But you know, there's some examples of when we've been able to work with organizations to make sure that they're not being misleading, even mistakenly. The example here on the slide is Mike News, which is generally good on these topics, and a fair news source, tweeted out during the Neil Gorsuch Supreme Court hearing that he said that he would refuse to overturn Roe v. Wade. That was an easy mistake to make. What he actually said was that he would refuse to comment on whether or not he would overturn Roe v. Wade. So I see where the error occurred there, but it matters, right? That's a pretty big distinction in the difference. And we and a number of other groups flagged this for them and sort of said, hey, we just want you to review this because we think it might mislead some people. And they deleted the tweet and were able to put out accurate information very soon afterwards. So, you know, we have that institutional ability to negotiate, to sort of be diplomatic about it, and sort of give your concerns a voice.
So after you've reported something, well, you've vetted it and reported it, the last thing you need to do is to be sure to replace it. And this is actually, I think, in some ways, one of the most important things you can do, because it's not just enough to fact check something or to flag that something might be inaccurate. If you don't give people any information to go on that then is the right version or replace it with an accurate story, it's much harder for them to remember the fact check in the future. So the next time they engage with that claim, if there's not a replacement piece of misinformation or a positive story about abortion and reproductive rights to kind of be on their mind, they'll go to engage with it and they'll think, well, I know that somebody disputed that this was right. I don't really know what the alternative is though. So I think absent another option, I'm going to believe this. And I think if you think back to the very first slide that I showed you about the study we did, remember that Fox News wasn't just misinforming about late-term abortion a lot. They were talking about it more than anyone else. And so you could fact check that, but without positive stories that explain the accuracy, or rather explain the circumstances or any of the information that we already discussed, people won't have anything to kind of go back to. And so you have to make sure that you're giving a full story about what's true and not just telling people they're wrong.
And we want to pause here when we talk about replacing and speaking sort of truths about reproductive rights and positive, happy stories and putting those out there into the ecosystem. We are realistic that that can have a blowback, particularly when you post about reproductive rights and abortion online. That can make you a target for harassment. And we want to be very, very clear that we do not recommend, particularly that you directly engage with anti-choice activists or bad actors online. Mostly because, frankly, your time and energy as activists are finite resources, and you can prioritize how you use them. I can directly engage with a professional pro-life activist online because I get paid to do so. And that at the end of the day, if I become a target of harassment, as I have been in the past, there are systems in place to protect me. You don't necessarily have those systems. And so thinking through what are some better uses of your time, and maybe that means that you're talking offline, you're talking to people who are movable or are simply unintentionally misinformed. Maybe you're talking just directly to friends if you are engaging online. That we really want to encourage you to think through that, you know, you do not have to sort of publicly talk about abortion all day, every day in order to be a good activist. That there are options here. But having said that, we do think that it is useful to talk online about reproductive rights more often if you feel comfortable doing so and if it makes sense in terms of your time and energy. These graphs are a little hard to read. Don't worry about it. I'll explain. One thing that NARAL does is that we have a great deal of data that studies, particularly Twitter, but also Facebook and some other online sources, just how often people are talking online and what are they talking about. So both of these graphs are of an average week last year in 2016, and we sort of broke it down. So people who are really vocally pro-choice activists online, what are they talking about in a given week, right? So some of them are talking about the latest Game of Thrones episode. They're talking about a sports game that they watch. They're talking about what they're having for dinner. And they're also talking about reproductive rights. And again, it's a little hard to see, but in blue, that blue line that you can see on that left graph, that's when people are talking about reproductive rights. So in the average week, talking about reproductive rights online, even from sort of dedicated pro-choice activists, it's just one of many topics. It's sort of in the middle among a lot of other things that are going on there. When you look at the graph on the right, however, what you see is that anti-choice activists talk about reproductive rights all the time. That very, very large top line on that graph that's circled in blue on the right there, that's them talking about reproductive rights. And they clearly just talk about it so much more than they talk about any other topic. And this actually matters. This means that when they're pushing fake news, when they're pushing misinformation, they're simply louder than we are. There's more volume to those misinformation, even if there are fewer of them, and I would argue sometimes that there are, particularly in certain online spaces, they're just posting all day long about abortion. And so they suck the oxygen out of the debate. And it becomes very difficult if you're just someone who, you know, is engaging online in a lot of different issues, when all you ever see are these pieces of misinformation and these pieces of fake news. Of course, that's going to be difficult to distance that from the truth. And so when we talk about replace and we talk about telling accurate stories, this is really what we're up against. I did want to, however, give us some hope. It's not that we never, as pro-choice activists, talk about reproductive rights online, nor is it that we sort of as a general populace talk about these. This graph shows most of the year last year in 2016. And again, it's a little hard to read, but what this is basically everyone on the internet talking about reproductive rights over the course of the year. And these big spikes in the graph that you see are moments, usually a day or two, maybe a week, where everyone online was talking about reproductive rights and we really broke through in the conversation. These moments include several of the presidential debates that occurred last year, particularly thanks to the Ask About Abortion campaign. The really thick line in the middle there, and this graph has been cut off at the top so you can't see all the descriptions, but that is the day that whole women's health was decided by the Supreme Court last June. And everyone was online talking about the decision, celebrating the decision, explaining the decision. So there are these really wonderful moments where really across the internet, across a lot of different subgroups of people we study, these conversations are happening. All I would like to see is for there to be more days like that, where the sort of baseline conversation around these issues, around positive, accurate stories, that gets lifted. And so it's not just limited to these one-off moments.
So what you can do today, is you can commit to taking action in your circle. You can join various our Twitters. We have them both on the screen here, at NARAL and at MMFA, and like either on Facebook. You can also text NARAL to 91990 to get signed up there, and then sign up for action alerts at email alerts and volunteer info for NARAL, and then action at MediaMatters.org for when we run campaigns.
And just a note about our text program, I am on the NARAL text program. I work for NARAL, that makes sense. But it's actually really neat. They don't text you a ton, but they'll text you when there's just a moment where there's a really clear action, calling your senator or something like that. And they'll just text you the number that you should call, and you can just click, and suddenly you're talking to a member of Congress. And it's a really great program, and I really, really recommend it for people who want to have activism be more involved in just your day-to-day life.
All right, well, this is Erin again, and I just signed up for NARAL Text, and I've got the bounce back, so I'm very excited. Thank you for that plug, Hannah. I also want to encourage everyone to sign up for alerts at reproaction.org. We do monthly Act and Learn webinars. We do these every single month. They are free. They are open to everyone. And we also encourage you to follow us on social media. We are Reproaction at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you should really be following us on Facebook for exciting, fun things. And then also we want to encourage you to save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar. So next month we'll be meeting on Thursday, June 22nd, and we're going to do another training. We're going to focus specifically on communications for activists, and we are so bold as to call it awesome communications for activists. It's going to be awesome. You don't want to miss this one. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my co-director, Pamela, to moderate us through the discussion.
Thank you very much, Erin. So if you do have questions, we've got quite a few that have stacked up, but if you have questions, you can certainly still drop them into the question tab, which is on your GoToWebinar control panel. So the first question is an interesting one. It's from Margot, and Margot says that she thinks that one of the best ways to argue about choice is to point out the lack of support for women to have a healthy pregnancy, to have gainful employment and parenting services. So why is that strategy not adopted more? And I think you talked about that a little bit when you were showing the side-by-side of what's getting discussed in online spaces. But if you could just address the different angles that people take, and which one do you think would be more beneficial?
Absolutely. I think that's a really great point, and it's a very strong argument. What we have found in particular is that when you're talking about these issues, making sure that you're discussing it in terms of economic freedom. A lot of people haven't been pregnant, right, and don't necessarily understand what that's like for women. They don't necessarily understand how dangerous that can be. Pregnancy is actually, in some ways, more dangerous than abortion. It's certainly more dangerous than it should be in the United States. And I think that talking about those issues, talking about the economic realities, just talking more about this is a really great place to start from. As I said, there's just not a lot of conversation out there. I think when it comes to the specific conversation about why, we don't talk about the lack of support, again, I think a lot of times we're not including women who have gone through these experiences in the conversation. Renee Bracey Sherman, who is an amazing activist on these issues, has a New York Times op-ed out today, I think, that really talks about, being a woman who's had an abortion, being an abortion doula, and helping bring those women into these conversations more often. So when you want to talk about the lack of support, having someone who's gone through that and who faced that lack of support and found it challenging, that person should be the focus of the conversation.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for that answer. And I was just absolutely cannot recommend enough that op-ed that Renee Bracey Sherman published in the New York Times. It's fantastic. So thank you for that. So we have another question. So this one's from Caitlin. What do you think the impact fake news has had on international reproductive health care policy, and specifically the global gag rule and expansion, and then the branding of it as a pro-life effort?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a really interesting connection to make between international policies, because I think a lot of times, even people who are very engaged on these issues, it's harder, I think, sometimes to keep in perspective that there's a huge number of services and a huge number of policies that impact people, and that the United States is instrumental in facilitating. So I think there's two parts to the answer. The first is that fake news and the misinformation that underlies it is hugely damaging, because precisely once it gets diffused past the United States and people maybe are engaging with our policies and information about them who aren't as familiar with our news sources or aren't as familiar with our policies, it gets much harder to debunk that information. So I think in particular, when these things are branded, and particularly misinformation is branded as fact, that can be hugely damaging. I think the second part then is the gag rule in particular. We actually at Media Matters did a study that after the initial executive order was signed expanding the gag rule and reinstating it, that network television not only didn't talk, network primetime cable news didn't talk about the consequences of expanding the gag rule, and they didn't report actually most times that it was expanded. They just reported that it was an executive order that was signed. So I think part of this is identifying fake news and vetting information, but also part of that is making sure that we're asking media outlets and we're holding people accountable to actually talk about the consequences of these policies, not just to treat them like political fodder.
Oh my goodness. I'm like, you can't see me, but I'm shaking my fist because that's one of my biggest pet peeves and frustrations with even some of the outlets that I really enjoy, that, I, as somebody who is constantly working with this kind of messaging and in this world, I'm shocked at how they'll talk about complex policy changes with absolutely no drill down. And I'm like screaming at the TV or screaming at my phone saying, where's your follow-up? Give some detail on that. So thank you for saying that. And then I had a personal question I'm going to plop in here in the midst of all of these, which is when I'm thinking about fake news as it applies to, how various things that are clearly defined, like emergency contraception. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on how that drills down into smaller media markets. And specifically, I encountered a big problem with emergency contraception and the way it was reported in local regional press in Missouri, and that actually started to come back at us when various policy was being moved. So if you could just talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Without seeing the specific story, I think I can speak to sort of generally how misinformation like that gets, taken up at the local level, and hopefully it'll answer your question. So I think that in particular, local outlets don't always have the same resources. And that's not to say that some of them aren't doing phenomenal work and doing really great reporting, but sometimes the people who are on call to write those stories don't always have access to the information or aren't as steeped in the issues, and so can think they're doing something to report on it accurately, but are actually getting caught up in some of the same problems that we're all having with information, which is that sometimes it's hard to vet things and it takes time, and you're writing on a timeline or on a deadline, and it's tough. And so I think the way that it happens at the local level is that because there's a lack of conversation about the accuracies, people aren't replacing, and most times the oxygen is just kind of sucked out of the political debate or out of discussion about what policies are and how, in this case, maybe policy changes affect emergency contraception access. And so when it gets to the local level and it gets to those people having to report, here's what's happening like in your backyard, they don't always have, the great model to work on, and they don't always have access to the resources and the time to get that. So I think hopefully something that can help change that then is that if more people, in local communities can be engaged in pushing back on that. An example I'll give is I'm from Iowa, and Planned Parenthood recently has to close 4 clinics there because of a defunding bill. Something that I've seen and that's been encouraging is that in instances where local media haven't been reporting on that accurately for some of the reasons I just discussed, I've seen people, talking back to them and like writing letters to the editor and like writing, trying to place op-eds. And it's little, but stuff like that adds up. And I think if papers are really interested and if local outlets are interested in engaging their audiences, they'll start listening, hopefully.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I actually think that the problem here is very similar to the previous question where we're talking about international policy. When something like the New York Times or CNN reports something inaccurately, even if it's just an honest mistake, it gives the seal of approval from these brands, essentially, that are considered very trustworthy and considered, just trustworthy and legitimate. And then you see problems overseas, you see problems in local papers where if you had no other reason not to, of course you're going to trust something because it showed up in the New York Times. Of course you're going to trust something because it was reported on CNN. Surely those guys who have the resources have done their homework. And so I think it's a problem that we have to sort of deal with at all ends of that food chain that we talked about at the beginning, that it's not enough to just say, oh, the problem is with Facebook and the problem is with, you know, these fake websites that keep popping up. That's not the only problem. This is a huge spectrum, and we need people at the local level engaging with their reporters, engaging with their papers. You would be surprised how willing a lot of these papers are to publish op-eds or to publish letters to the editor, because frankly, they're not as used to having readership input in a lot of ways. You know, they don't have the readership that a lot of bigger organizations have, and they want to engage with that readership. And then we also need the institutional pressure on those bigger names to make sure that they're not making those mistakes, and that when they are, again, they're holding themselves accountable and they're being honest about those mistakes, and they're engaging that debate. And so it's really, it can feel overwhelming at times because it's sort of coming at us from all directions. But what I hope people get out of this is how easy it is to push back. That doing the little thing of reporting something on Facebook, even if you think you might be the only person who reports a post as fake news, you probably aren't. And that actually collective action works really, really fast and really, really well. And the internet is amazing, as we all know. And you might be one of, you know, thousands of people who reported that post, and suddenly that post is gone. And at the end of the spectrum, you know, really speaking out as much as possible, posting those positive, accurate stories as much as possible, just contributing to a general cultural conversation that doesn't push stigma, that doesn't push inaccuracy. And then that makes it easier for organizations like NARAL that are membership-based to be able to turn around to, whether it's the New York Times or whether it's, you know, senators, and say, look, we have millions of members, and they're really mad right now, and they're really mad that you're pushing this misinformation. They're really mad that you're passing these policies, and then, you know, we can harness that collective action. So I think just, you know, even doing something that feels small on a day-to-day basis, it adds to a larger conversation that is so necessary right now.
Definitely.
Great feedback and great advice. So thank you so much for that. So I'm not going to say this name right, and I apologize because it looks like a beautiful name, but Elisa wanted us to repeat the number to get text alerts from NARAL.
Sure. The number is 91990. Yep, it's there on the screen. And you just want to text NARAL, the word NARAL, NARAL, to that number, and you'll be signed up for the text alerts. It's a new program that we're putting, and I'm very proud of it. It's very helpful.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for that question. And then we have a question from Katie, who wonders if you can direct us to some resources to help debunk the science, in quotes, that anti-abortion movement uses sometimes, things like proof, again in quotes, that of fetal pain.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of answers to this. The first is that there are organizations that have sort of done some of the work of trying to gather those resources. I know at Media Matters, every time we see this claim pop up or start to get national prominence again, we'll try to assemble a set of resources. So we have some content on our website about that cites, you know, medical studies, that cites professional organizations of physicians talking about this issue. I think the second part then is that you can do some of the reading of these studies and some of the Googling around the sources that are being used to support it, for example. So in a lot of cases, the medical studies that are being used to try and support, you know, the concept of fetal pain have methodological flaws or come from overtly political or ideological sources. And so I think there are ways of accessing good information about this, and a lot of, like, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has a good report on this. The Royal College has a good report on this as well. But a lot of times you can kind of reverse engineer where the misinformation is coming from and get a better sense of kind of where the claim is.
Yeah, and in terms of groups that do really great research on this, I can't recommend Guttmacher enough. It's kind of a weird word if you've never seen it spelled, but it's Guttmacher, Guttmacher. They do amazing research, and they do a great job of pulling together a lot of the existing research that's out there. Physicians for Reproductive Health are also really great when you're looking for resources on this. And then the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists is just a really wonderful organization that has come out a lot. They
submitted an amicus brief.
Yeah, they submit amicus briefs in relevant Supreme Court cases. They really don't shy away from saying, you know, there's no medical evidence to support this, and here's where the problems arise. And so I really rely on those resources.
Mm-hmm. Great stuff. Thank you so much. So the next question is going to be from Marinella. How do you counter the noise coming from social media bots that are active 24/7?
Yeah, the bots are hard. I mean, I think particularly on Twitter, you can report users. And again, Twitter does not have a great history of dealing with these reports, but I think they are getting somewhat better. And moments when they have sort of done well have often been, again, these collective action moments where you have tons and tons of people reporting a bot or an individual. I think the noise is always going to be there. So this is part of why one of our recommendations is to really create our own noise, create our own positive, accurate noise. I think some of it is also personal and sort of being vigilant about blocking and about muting or whatever you need to do to make sure that you're blocking out the noise. That doesn't eliminate it. But I find as an activist that it can be very draining if I feel like I'm drowning in that noise all day, every day, and going back to sort of self-care and thinking through what is going to make me the most effective purveyor of accurate information. It's if I'm not listening to these things all day. When it comes to bots, it's really hard. But I think, you know, Twitter in particular, their problems have mostly been with harassment from real people. And that generally when you can recognize a bot, that they'll delete the bot. It's a real problem though. Never tweet is my best help, but
it is a challenge. It is a challenge. So we have time for one more question because we are super prompt here at Reproaction. So I know everybody's time is precious. But we have a question from M. Doug that many anti-choice people will approach the reproductive health topic from their religious stance and what is the most effective in discussing this personal issue, most of whom are full of misinformation provided by their usually male religious leader. And I just want to highlight, thank you for that question, but just want to highlight that our webinar attendees are so awesome that Catherine, who is the next question, actually said, just wanted to highlight for pro-choice individuals of faith that there is an organization called Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. They are phenomenal. Thank you, Catherine. So back to M. Doug's question.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to recommend them too. They're great. And sort of every brand of religion you can think of, Catholics for Choice, Jews for Choice, though that most Jews are for choice in my experience, but there's a lot of different resources out there if you are a person of faith. I think in terms of responding when you get those sort of questions thrown at you, one is to really get the conversation back to policy. These are real policies that affect real women, and we ostensibly have a separation of church and state in this country. And so while someone may have personal religious belief, reminding them that we need to have these discussions in terms of the real policies that are going to affect women regardless of their faith. And then I think just generally saying, like, you know, we can have a conversation about faith. I certainly do quite a lot, but we need to make sure that conversation is again couched and is being led by the people who have had these experiences. So yes, unfortunately, the pro-life movement is largely run by men who have not had these experiences. And so we want to make sure that we're lifting up the voices of the women, the trans people, anyone who's really gone through these experiences, and doing the best that we can to frame the conversation around their priorities.
Great answer. Thank you so very much. So we have come to the hour in which we conclude. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the fantastic questions from our attendees. And Hannah and Sharon, thank you for this amazing presentation. It's so much information and so helpful in navigating our Zoom.
Thank you.
No problem. All right. That concludes today's webinar. Thanks, everybody. Have a fantastic rest of your evening.
Thank you.